This week on Just Solutions, there's a lot at stake in the 2022 midterm elections. 34 Senate seats and 435 House seats will be on the ballot, along with countless races for local and statewide positions playing out all across the country. People's Action is working to elect candidates that reflect the real-life experiences and identities of everyday voters. Their Rise Up 2022 strategy seeks to boost progressive power by organising in competitive races to flip Republican-held swing seats. Brooke Adams, Director of Movement Politics at People's Action, joins us to talk about the deep canvassing techniques they're using to engage voters around progressive policies and to engage with voters who are typically shut out of politics and ignored by the Democratic establishment. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Brooke, it's great to have you with us. Tell us exactly what your plans are at People's Action for the upcoming midterm elections. What is the Rise Up 2022 campaign?
Great. And first off, thank you, Maeve, for having me here today. It is an honor, and thank you for the question. So People's Action, since its inception, has been working on electing progressive champions to all levels of office. And our focus is on recruiting and electing people who are not only supportive of our issue campaigns for things like Medicare for All, a homes guarantee, just climate solutions, and more, but also people who come from a working class background who really represent the members of our member organizations and will govern alongside the working class people that they represent. So in 2022, our plans are no different. We are electing progressive champions up and down the ballot for things like city councils, state legislatures, and also to federal office. And our focus this midterm cycle is specifically on electing progressive champions in Republican-held swing districts to federal office. The reason for this, we have seen a lot of progressive victories in the past decade, from the Squad Plus to electing some of our own members, such as Rick Krajewski or Nikhil Saval to state office. But when we look at the progressive victories that have happened all across the country, the reality is the majority of these have happened in safely blue areas. And so politically, this leaves us as a movement vulnerable, right, to arguments from people like Senator Manchin or Sinema that progressive ideas aren't popular, quote unquote, where they really count. Now, People's Action has been organizing in some of these same areas, right, that overlap with rural turf, small cities. And what we find is that things like having better healthcare, things like protecting our environment are actually, in fact, quite popular, right? The majority of voters do want these improvements in their lives. So it is upon us to actually organize in these turfs to elect progressive champions so that we can start to build our own bench of federal legislators in Republican-held swing turf and ultimately help the Democratic Party win in the midterms. And the other thing I will say here is that part of the reason that we find it so critical for us to build infrastructure in some of these areas in 2022 is that while, we have made lots of victories as a progressive movement, the Republican Party has made huge inroads with working class voters in the past decade. And we are starting to enter a period where Republicans represent both wealthy voters, but also many elements of the working class. And Democrats are trending towards representing more high-income voters while its working class base atrophies. So we at People's Action are really building out a strategy to provide a solution for this, right? Building a working class base in some of the areas where the party has struggled so that we can start to get our own champions elected by leading on a bold vision such as healthcare, a homes guarantee, et cetera, for all Americans here in this country. And the other thing I will say is that, while our strategy for federal elections is to focus on Republican-held turf, we're also building a candidate pipeline to train and develop our own leaders to run for office at the local level, because we think it's really critical that everyone sees a pathway towards being a part of governing, right? Whether it's being a part of one of our member organizations or ultimately running for office themselves, because many of our members who have been really close to some of the problems that our issue campaigns are aiming to address are also really close to the solutions, right? And have been part of developing our long-term agenda, our issue campaigns, and we want to see a pathway for them to run for city councils and state legislatures, and long-term federal office as well.
Well, I want to dig into what some of those issues are that are playing out and are being popular with voters from all backgrounds, whether it is Medicare for all, lower prescription costs, addressing the climate crisis, and how your deep canvassing techniques has really identified that these are popular issues all across America. But I do want to dig in a little bit about getting progressive candidates elected. And as we mentioned in the intro, you're really reaching out to folks who feel left behind by the Democratic establishment. And the Democratic establishment, the big players in the Democratic Party, still distance themselves, it seems, from progressive candidates and issues. And recently, I think in the past week, Hillary Clinton in an interview said that we have to, cautioned these progressive candidates. Are these the candidates that we should be, embracing? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? That, the mainstream Democratic establishment seems to still distance itself from so-called progressive candidates or ideas, despite the fact that these ideas and policies are widely embraced by Americans.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Maeve. There are two things I would say. The first is that this should come as no surprise to us, because the reality is that there is a whole infrastructure of corporate power backing establishment Democrats, that results in millions of dollars being spent lobbying elected officials to oppose progressive policies. And that's because corporations all across this country have a direct stake in blocking us from winning these things that are popular across the American electorate. So I would say, first off, it is no surprise that, establishment Dems across the party continue to predict that Democrats need to, essentially move towards the center in order to win. I believe it is a losing strategy. Democrats have tried this time and time again, and it has proven to be a recipe for loss. Look at what happened in the Virginia elections not too long ago, right? We ran a centrist Dem and ultimately found that Democrats underperformed in rural areas, and their strategy for counting on suburban areas did not work. And so I would say that, it is critical that we actually acknowledge the fact that we need to win in 2022. And the recipe for doing that is to campaign on issues and ideas that are popular with the American people.
Well, take us through what those issues and ideas that are so popular actually are. And then we'll transition to talking about the Build Back Better plan, because I know that People's Action is very supportive of that, because that covers many of these issues that you are hearing directly from folks in rural areas and small cities, that these are what they're concerned about. So what are some of the major issues and campaigns that you're supporting in People's Action, things that you've heard directly from voters in these areas that are important to them?
Yes. So I actually think a lot of these issues, as you mentioned, Maeve, directly overlap with elements of the Build Back Better plan that we are hopefully going to move through the Senate soon. A few things I would say: over 2/3 of Americans support raising taxes on corporations and the wealthy. So, a lot of questions get asked on how we're going to pay for some of the other major principles that the American electorate support. And this is it, right? 2/3 of Americans believe that corporations and the wealthy should pay their fair share to fund programs that we desperately need. Over 80% of adults believe that prescription drugs are too expensive. So People's Action has been working through our healthcare campaign to identify policy solutions to lower prescription drug costs. The majority of Americans support Medicare for all, right? This is shown in poll after poll. And oftentimes when people vote against it, it's because of confusion and disinformation that is seeded by the right. But in reality, the majority of Americans do believe that Medicare for all would benefit their lives. Another thing I would mention: the majority of Americans support new nonprofit and publicly owned homes and rent caps. So when we're talking about housing, oftentimes, again, real estate developers and corporations will pour tons of money into lobbying against progressive housing policies. But when you look at what people support, again, most Americans believe that we should have rent caps and new nonprofit and publicly owned homes. And the final thing I will say is that every poll shows that the majority of Americans believe in climate change and are, in fact, alarmed by it. So again, this is something that is on voters' minds over and over and over again.
And you know this because of the work that People's Action has been doing. And we talked about the deep canvassing. So, for people who aren't familiar with that term or that work, take us through exactly how People's Action has campaigned this deep listening, essentially, this deep canvassing technique to speak to voters in those areas that are in rural communities, in small cities, that are often, as we have mentioned a couple of times, feeling shut out from the democratic process. What is deep canvassing and how has it been used by People's Action?
Yes, so deep canvassing is exactly what you said, Maeve. It is a strategy that is rooted in listening. One of the problems that People's Action is trying to solve for is that too often we find that campaigning is run by consultants in DC that are testing polls, delivering a one-size-fits-all message to voters that frankly doesn't resonate and that is vulnerable to a lot of the right-wing attacks that seed confusion and disinformation amongst these communities. And so with deep canvassing, we are practicing a whole new method of campaigning that is rooted in listening and building relationships and vulnerability, right? Sharing stories of the real lived experiences that are impacting all of our lives. So instead of training our canvassers to deliver a one-size-fits-all message, we train them on softer skills like how to lead with compassion, how to actually share vulnerable stories about what's impacting us, and ultimately how to ask questions and dig in with voters on the things that matter to them rather than the talking points that they may have heard on CNN or Fox News. So ultimately, deep canvassing is a way for us to cut through the noise and talk to people face to face, human to human, and build connection that can be deeper than, again, just what people hear on the news in their day-to-day lives. And the other thing I would say is that, oftentimes people think of deep canvassing as just longer conversations, but it's actually much, much more than that. It is a whole strategy to build a multiracial working class coalition that can withstand some of the racist dog whistle attacks that are coming from the right and help us transform our politics and economy to serve working people. And it's a strategy that's rooted in the assumption that not enough working people are with us right now, and that we have to not only inoculate people against right-wing attacks, but also really reach them and persuade them through compassion, through curiosity, and through digging in really deep and building connections that can last beyond just an election cycle. And as you've said many times, Maeve, the reality is most Americans do share basic values, right? That drive us all to want to live healthy, fulfilling lives. But we get blasted so regularly with fear-driven messaging that drives wedges between people and ultimately motivates them to vote against their own interests. So deep canvassing is fundamentally about preaching beyond the choir and organizing with people who aren't already with us through building that human one-on-one connection.
So give us an example of how it works and how people can have these conversations, because we've also featured on Just Solutions people who are trying to help others bridge some of those divisions. How do you talk to family members, to neighbors, to people that are within your social circle who have very different ideas? It does seem that finding a commonality of language is the key, because as you have said, and as we have mentioned, we do care about the same things, but how we approach it and how we maybe talk about it is potentially problematic. So how do these deep canvassing conversations actually play out?
That's a great question, Maeve. The number one thing is that we train all of our canvassers on storytelling, because it is so fundamental that we are able, again, to cut through some of the noise. Because when people hear words like Medicare for All or Green New Deal, oftentimes they think of what they've heard on the news, right, about these trigger words, and are motivated by fear, right, of what is unknown, of what impact they've been told this will have on their lives. But a lot of the messaging they've received is full of lies that are fed by the right, and oftentimes racist lies, right? That motivate people to blame other people who don't look like them for the problems that they're experiencing. And so storytelling is the most powerful tool that we have found is able to cut through some of this fear and build a relationship with voters that is instead motivated by hope, by compassion, by a vision for how we all might benefit if we have a government and an economy that cares for all of us. So when we have these deep canvassing conversations, our canvassers will open with questions that surface how a voter might feel. But immediately after that, they will tell stories and actually ask voters questions that prompt them to share their own experiences that are related to some of the issues that we are talking to voters about. And ultimately, in our deep canvas conversations, right, it's not just about that storytelling, it's also about persuasion. So canvassers will essentially, surface any conflict that voters might be feeling and work through that conflict instead of getting defensive or, going straight back to facts or talking points, and give a voter space to actually surface why they might feel that conflict. And then ultimately, our canvassers will make the case for how the policies and the candidates that we're talking to voters about will benefit everyone's lives.
And has this technique proven to be successful? I mean, I know a lot of your focus is on local issues, local elections, local races. Have you seen an impact of these deep canvassing techniques in some of these communities where you've been working?
Absolutely, yes. And I think the 2020 elections are one of the biggest examples of this. So, deep canvassing is a tactic that has typically been used for issue campaigns. But in 2020, People's Action really wanted to see if we could test this tactic for political work and actually moving conflicted voters in the presidential election. And so we set out and ran an experiment where we tested whether deep canvassing had more or less of an impact than your more traditional direct voter contact campaigns. And we found through our experiment that we were over 102 times as effective in moving voters in battleground states. So this is all publicly available research that we did, 102 times more effective. And so that motivated us to launch a whole volunteer program oriented around defeating Donald Trump. And what we found is there was a huge base of people who were interested in deep canvassing with us. We ended up with over 35,000 volunteers who had nearly 300,000 deep canvas conversations in 8 battleground states. And overall, of the people who initially told us they were conflicted or more in support of Donald Trump, we were able to persuade 25.6% of them to say they were voting for President Biden by the end of the conversation. So ultimately, this tactic was really effective for persuading people. But that's not it, right? I think deep canvassing is powerful for winning elections. It is also extremely powerful for transforming both canvassers and the people they canvass. We had a volunteer Slack where people were posting stories of the conversations they had with voters. And day after day, dozens of people were in that Slack talking about how conversations they had would bring them to tears because they found that someone who was conflicted and maybe had different political orientations than them were sharing stories that deeply resonated about things that their family members had been experiencing since the onset of the pandemic, unemployment stories, right? Things that united people. And again, transformed not only the people who we were talking to, but the volunteers who were canvassing with us.
Well, we'd love to hear from our viewers. Let us know where you're watching. Let us know your thoughts on the upcoming midterm elections and maybe what's playing out in your own communities. As we're talking about effective techniques that have been pioneered really by People's Action, Michelle, who's watching on Facebook, says the bad guys are trying to take over local. And there is a lot of concern about what will play out in the local, statewide, regional elections, as well, of course, as the 34 Senate seats and every House seat that's up in the national election this year. You said you're focusing very much as well, Brooke, on local elections. I mean, what is playing out at a local level? We're seeing such conflict in school boards, of course, with what's happening with CRT and COVID restrictions, but also very critical local level elections. that are playing out, in communities all around the country. What is your experience about what's happening at a local level here?
Yes, thank you for this question as well. I think it is, there is no political strategy in this country that is complete without a major focus at the local level as well. And I do want to lift up that this was a huge part of how the right took power in this country, was actually focusing on school boards, state legislatures. And I want to turn our attention for a second to state legislatures in particular, because I think it's been one area where we have been, frankly, losing ground over the past decade. And it has huge consequences, not only for what local policy gets written, but also for voting rights across this country, right? State legislatures ultimately draw lines for congressional districts as well as state districts. And Republicans control 18 states' congressional maps, whereas Democrats only control 7. And when these maps get drawn, the borders last for 10 whole years. And so what are the consequences of this? Well, we have seen Democrats win more statewide votes than Republicans in Michigan, Wisconsin, and North Carolina in every election in the past decade, but Republicans are still in charge of the state governments in all 3 of these states. This is just one example. There's many consequences when we aren't serious about what it means for us to win at the state level. So we need to get really serious about taking back state governments, right? Running our own people who can be state representatives, state senators. And a lot of these races are races that we ultimately have the power to win, right? If we organize every single day now through November. And when we do so, we will not only tip the balance of power in these state governments back in our favor, but we'll also create conditions for us to win state level policies that will impact everyone's lives and also build out a model for what we can win at the federal level. The other thing I would mention is that, it's not just about winning at the state level. There's also city councils that ultimately have been represented by people who are not in touch with the needs of our communities for far, far too long. And all of us know people, right? Whether it's from organizing, whether it's from just local communities we've been a part of, who would be better representatives for the working people in these districts than the folks who are currently in office. So one of the things that's really critical for us at People's Action is building resources for folks who want to run so that we can train and develop our own people to be in those elected positions.
I'm very glad that you mentioned the attacks on voting rights, because as you said, these are playing out in state legislatures all around the country. And so what's happening at a local level is trickling up to have huge impacts at a federal level. We've also seen that playing out with abortion restrictions in states like Texas that could potentially influence what happens for federal regulations as well. So with the attacks essentially on voting rights and with the lack of action at a congressional level around protecting voting rights, we've seen a couple of major bills languishing essentially. I mean, what are your concerns as we head into the 2022 midterms? I mean, because people are quite concerned about what might play out because of these voting restrictions.
Yeah, look, so you cannot talk about voting rights restrictions and attacks without also talking about corporate power in this country. People's Action recently wrote a report with Demos examining the corporate money that has gone into blocking Build Back Better. Lots more to say on that, but one of the major findings, which again should come as no surprise, is that some of the same corporations that have spent the most money lobbying our federal elected officials to block Build Back Better are also pouring money into state legislative races to help elect people who are writing or sponsoring voter suppression legislation, right? So think about that for a second. These same corporations that are preventing us from having better healthcare, housing, real climate reform are also pouring tons of money into suppressing our right to vote, right? And it should come as no surprise because, again, lots of the major policies in Build Back Better are quite popular with the American electorate. So corporations have a direct stake in preventing us from getting out and voting, and specifically from in preventing Black and Brown communities in working class areas from coming out and voting. So I think it is critical for us to think about, corporate power when talking about voter suppression and what we can do to actually pass meaningful legislation that prevents corporations from pouring money into electoral races, but also electing champions who refuse corporate donations and who will really govern alongside working class people.
Well, just in the few minutes that we have left, of course, the Build Back Better plan, if it does get introduced or passed, it's a much watered down version of the original version, and a lot of progressives very concerned about that. So with the success of the deep canvassing techniques that People's Action have pioneered, as we have said, and it's very impactful as well, how could something like that, say, impact something like the Build Back Better plan? Is there a connection between the two? I mean, how can your proven techniques help for that type of legislation, or indeed, say, the voting rights acts as well that are also languishing in Congress?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree, Maeve. The Build Back Better plan is a good start, but it is only that, right? A start. There is, in reality, a lot more that we have to do to win Medicare for all, safe and affordable housing for all people, and real climate legislation that prevents the disaster that is oncoming. That being said, there's a lot in the Build Back Better plan that People's Action is excited about. Some things to just start, right? Letting Medicare negotiate lower prices for some prescription drugs could have a huge impact for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in this country. 4 weeks of paid family leave, extending the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, all wonderful pieces of policy that will impact Americans' lives, making hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in clean water, clean energy, climate investments, et cetera. So in terms of how deep canvassing can help further these efforts, deep canvassing on all of our issues is fundamentally about how we can move people to support government spending and a stronger government that can build an economy where all of us can thrive, right? Whether we're talking to people about immigration, climate, healthcare, or even candidates, a lot of the conflicts that people ultimately feel on these issues are rooted in a disbelief that government can work for them. And there's a reason for that. Not only has the Republican Party poured tons and tons of money, and Democrats too, actually, into fear-driven messaging that leads people to think that government can't work for them. But the reality is that we have not provided benefits to many, many Americans on issues that have been critical, right, for their livelihood in this country. So deep canvassing lives sort of in this area of tension where we are moving people to believe in a government that can work for them, while also fighting to win policies that will benefit their lives. And ultimately, right, we need to not only win policies, but also restore faith and in some ways heal the American electorate from experiences that have driven them to believe that government cannot work for them.
Well, I know there's a lot more information about all of the work being done by People's Action, including their campaigns for 2022 and the report that you referenced there. But Brooke Adams, I would like to thank you very much for being our guest today. As we said, people can find out more information at the website for People's Action. Brooke, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Maeve.
And don't forget, Just Solutions is now available as a podcast. Subscribe to it, never miss an episode, listen to past episodes, and engage with us on social media. Let us know your thoughts on all of these issues. And join us again next week, same time, same place, for Free Speech TV's Just Solutions.